Sometimes the smallest acts of faith can heal the deepest wounds. Sometimes God uses the most unlikely messengers to remind us that hope never truly dies. Officer Tom Mitchell was just trying to make it through another empty evening when a barefoot little girl walked up to his patrol car and said, "Follow me to church." He thought she was lost. He thought he was just doing his job by helping her. But when Tom followed that child to an abandoned chapel on the edge of town, he discovered something that would shake him to his core. Inside that crumbling building, a 7-year-old girl had been caring for her dying grandmother all alone. But that wasn't the miracle. The miracle was what this little girl knew about Tom's late wife's secrets that should have been impossible for her to know. How could a child he'd never met before know the very words Sarah had whispered to him on her deathbed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains of 312 Maple Street, casting familiar shadows across the worn wooden table where Tom Mitchell sat with his coffee growing cold. 6 months had passed since Sarah's funeral, yet he still set out 2 mugs each morning, a habit that felt both comforting and cruel. The silence in their small ranch house pressed against him like a physical weight, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock Sarah had inherited from her mother. Tom wrapped his weathered hands around the ceramic mug, feeling the heat seep through his palms. At 52, his sandy hair showed more gray than it had a year ago, and the lines around his blue eyes had deepened from grief rather than laughter. He'd been a Cedar Falls police officer for 30 years, earning respect through quiet competence and genuine care for his community. But lately, even the job that had once given him purpose felt hollow. The leather-bound journal on the counter drew his attention, Sarah's diary, filled with her elegant handwriting and daily prayers. He'd discovered it weeks after the funeral, tucked away in her knit-stand drawer alongside a worn Bible and a small velvet box containing her grandmother's rosary. Tom had only read a few entries before closing it, overwhelmed by the intimacy of her private thoughts and the depth of faith. He'd never fully understood Sarah had been the spiritual anchor in their marriage of 28 years. While Tom attended church services beside her, nodding at the right moments and singing hymns from memory, she lived her faith with quiet conviction. She volunteered at the food bank, visited elderly neighbors, and somehow always knew exactly what to say when someone was hurting. After her diagnosis 18 months ago, her faith had only grown stronger, while his had begun to crack under the weight of unanswered prayers. The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. Carol Henderson's familiar voice crackled through the receiver. She'd been the dispatch operator for a Cedar Falls Police Department longer than Tom had been wearing a badge. "Morning, Tom. Sheriff Martinez wants to see you in his office when you come in. Nothing urgent. Just checking on you." "Thanks, Carol. I'll be there soon." Tom knew what the meeting would entail. Sheriff Martinez had been his friend for over 2 decades, and lately, his concerned glances had become more frequent. Everyone at the department was walking on eggshells around him, offering awkward condolences and avoiding mention of Sarah's name. Their kindness was genuine, but it only emphasized the crater her absence had left in his life. He showered and dressed in his uniform, with mechanical precision pressed, khakis, navy polo with the Cedar Falls PD emblem, polished black boots. The badge felt heavier than usual as he pinned it to his chest, though he couldn't explain why. Before leaving, he paused at the bedroom dresser where Sarah's photo smiled at him from a silver frame. In the picture, taken during their anniversary dinner last spring, her auburn hair caught the restaurant's candlelight, and her green eyes sparkled with the joy that had defined their relationship. "Another day, sweetheart," he whispered, touching the glass with his fingertip. The simple gold wedding band he now wore on a chain around his neck caught the light. He'd removed it from his finger the day after the funeral. Unable to bear the constant reminder, but unwilling to take it off completely. The drive to the station took him through the heart of Cider Falls, a town of 8,000 nestled in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. Main Street boasted the kind of businesses that had weathered decades of economic ups and downs. Murphy's hardware store, where old-timers gathered each morning to solve the world's problems. Rosie's Diner, famous for apple pie and gossip. And the First Baptist Church, where Sarah had sung in the choir every Sunday for 15 years. October had painted the maple trees in brilliant reds and golds, and Sarah would have insisted on driving the scenic route to admire God's handiwork. She found wonder in the smallest things, the way frost formed patterns on winter windows, how daffodils pushed through snow, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the elementary school playground. Tom had loved watching the world through her eyes, seeing magic where he might have noticed only the mundane dot. The Cedar Falls Police Department occupied a modest brick building on 3rd Street, sharing space with the town hall and volunteer fire department. Tom parked his personal vehicle, a 10-year-old Ford pickup that had seen better days, and walked through the front entrance where Carol sat behind the reception desk, her gray hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. "He's waiting for you, honey," she said, her voice gentle with the maternal concern she showed all the officers. Carol had lost her own husband 5 years earlier and understood grief's unpredictable tides. Sheriff Martinez looked up from paperwork as Tom knocked. On his open door, Miguel Martinez had emigrated from Mexico as a child, worked his way through college, and built a reputation as one of the most respected law enforcement officers in the county. His dark eyes held genuine warmth as he gestured for Tom to take a seat. "How are you holding up, my friend?" The question Tom had heard countless times since Sarah's death. He gave his standard response, taking it one day at a time. "That's all any of us can do." Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying Tom's face. "You know, I'm not going to pressure you about anything, but I want you to know that grief counseling is available to the department. Dr. Patricia Wells has helped other officers work through difficult times." Tom nodded, though he had no intention of sitting in a stranger's office discussing his pain. "I appreciate that, Miguel. Really. The offer stands whenever you're ready." Martinez shuffled through some papers. "I've got you on evening patrol this week. Figured you might prefer the quieter hours." Evening patrol meant fewer interactions with the public, more time alone with his thoughts. Tom wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse, but he appreciated his friend's consideration. "That works fine." The conversation drifted to routine. Department matters, upcoming training requirements, budget discussions, personnel schedules. Tom found himself going through the motions, responding appropriately while his mind wandered to memories of Sarah. She would have been preparing for her morning shift at the elementary school library, helping children find books and fostering their love of reading. The kids adored her gentle patience and infectious enthusiasm for stories. After the meeting, Tom spent the morning catching up on paperwork and reviewing case files. Lunch was a solitary affair at his desk, a sandwich from home that tasted like cardboard. He'd never fully appreciated how much Sarah's presence had flavored every aspect of his life until it was gone dot as afternoon shadows lengthened. Tom prepared for his evening patrol. He checked his equipment with practiced efficiency: radio, flashlight, first aid kit, incident reports. The familiar routine provided small comfort, a sense of purpose, even when everything else felt uncertain. The patrol car smelled of coffee and the pine air freshener that hung from the rearview mirror. Tom adjusted the seat and mirrors, started the engine, and pulled onto Main Street as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Evening patrol in Cedar Falls typically involved checking on local businesses, monitoring school zones after sports practices, and making his presence known in neighborhoods where residents appreciated seeing a police cruiser drive by. He made his usual rounds past the high school, where football practice was wrapping up. through the residential areas where porch lights were beginning to flicker on, along the industrial road where the old textile mill stood empty after closing 2 years earlier. The routine was comforting in its predictability, a rhythm that had sustained him through 3 decades of service. As twilight deepened, Tom found himself thinking about retirement. He had enough years to qualify for full benefits, and lately, the idea of stepping away from law enforcement held unexpected appeal. Maybe he could find work that didn't require him to witness human suffering on a regular basis. Maybe he could travel to the places Sarah had always wanted to visit: Ireland, where her great-grandparents had been born, or the Pacific Northwest, where she dreamed of seeing the redwood forests. But the thought of a future without structure, without the identity that being a police officer provided, felt almost as daunting as the loneliness that already consumed his evenings. Work, at least, gave him somewhere to go each day and a reason to get dressed in the morning. The radio crackled with routine calls: a fender bender on Route 15, a noise complaint about teenagers congregating behind the old movie theater, a request for a welfare check on an elderly resident whose daughter lived out of state. Tom responded to each call with professional competence, going through motions that had become second nature over the years. By 8 o'clock, full darkness had settled over Cedar Falls. Tom parked at the station to complete his paperwork before heading home to another microwave dinner and an evening of television that wouldn't hold his attention. The prospect of another night alone in the house where every room held memories of Sarah made his chest tight with familiar dread. That was when she appeared, a small figure emerging from the shadows near the station's front entrance, moving with the quiet determination of someone far older than her apparent age. Tom's trained eye immediately cataloged the details. Barefoot, despite the October chill, clothes that had seen better days, dirt smudges on pale cheeks, and an expression of solemn purpose that seemed incongruous on such a young face. The child couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with straight brown hair that needed a good brushing and intelligent dark eyes that met his gaze without fear. She approached his patrol car with the confidence of someone who had never been taught to be afraid of police officers. Tom lowered his window, immediately shifting into protective mode. In his experience, children who appeared alone after dark were usually lost, hurt, or running from something. His voice took on the gentle tone he perfected over years of dealing with frightened kids. "Hey there, sweetie. Are you okay? Are you lost?" The little girl tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him oddly uncomfortable. When she spoke, her voice was clear and certain, without a trace of the uncertainty he would have expected from a child in her situation. "Follow me to church." The words hung in the cooling air between them, simple yet somehow profound. Tom felt an unexpected stirring in his chest, as if something long dormant had been suddenly awakened by 4 quietly spoken words from a barefoot child who should have been home safe in bed. Tom stared at the child for a long moment, processing her unexpected request. In 30 years of police work, he'd encountered countless lost children and family emergencies. This felt different. The girl's calm demeanor, her direct gaze, the way she stood with quiet dignity despite her obvious need for help. "What's your name, honey?" Tom asked, stepping out of his patrol car and crouching to her eye level. "Lucy," she replied simply, her small fingers playing with a wooden cross hanging from a frayed string around her neck. The carving was crude but careful, clearly handmade with love. "Where are your parents? Where do you live?" She pointed toward the outskirts of town. "I live with Grandma Rose at the old church, St. Mary's. She's sick and told me to find you specifically." Tom felt a chill. "How does your grandmother know me?" Lucy's dark eyes seemed to hold secrets far beyond her years. "She said Officer Tom Mitchell has a kind heart, even when it's broken. She said you'd understand about taking care of someone you love." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. How could this child know about his broken heart? Where exactly? At St. Mary's? Will you follow me? She's been waiting for you. St. Mary's Catholic Church had been abandoned for nearly a decade. Tom had driven past it countless times, noting the gradual decay, but never imagining anyone might be living inside. Lucy, people can't live in that old church. It's not safe. We make do, Lucy said matter-of-factly. Grandma Rose taught me how to take care of things. Every fiber of his training told him to call social services immediately. But something in Lucy's dignity and complete lack of fear made him hesitate. How long have you been living there? Since the summer, after they tried to take me away from Grandma Rose. Lucy's chin lifted with quiet defiance. I won't let them separate us again. She's all I have left. Tom understood a sick elderly woman, a young girl caught in the foster care system, desperation driving them to find shelter wherever they could. Please, Officer Mitchell, Lucy continued, her eyes glistening. She doesn't have much time left. All she wants is to spend her last days with me, not in some hospital where strangers make decisions about our lives. Tom felt his professional detachment crumbling. This child was asking him to bend rules, yet her words about watching someone suffer resonated deeply. Show me, he said quietly. Relief flooded Lucy's features. She climbed into his patrol car, fastening her seatbelt with practiced movements. Tom radioed dispatch with a deliberately vague message about conducting a welfare check. The drive to St. Mary's took 10 minutes. The stone church loomed against the night sky like a monument to forgotten faith. Lucy led him to a side entrance where a basement door stood ajar. We live in the basement, Lucy explained, producing a small flashlight. It's warmer and safer. Tom followed her down stone stairs into what had once been the fellowship hall. The space had been transformed into a makeshift living area with remarkable ingenuity. Heavy blankets created private spaces, and candles provided flickering light. The air smelled of melted wax and illness, a scent Tom recognized from Sarah's final months. Grandma Rose? Lucy called softly. I brought Officer Mitchell, a weak voice answered from the corner. Bring him here, child. Let me see this man Sarah spoke of so often. Tom's blood went cold. Sarah? He followed Lucy toward an elderly African-American woman lying on a makeshift bed of church cushions and blankets. Despite her obvious frailty, Rose radiated quiet dignity. Officer Mitchell, Rose said, her voice barely a whisper. Thank you for coming. Tom knelt beside her bed. Ma'am, you need medical attention, and Lucy needs proper care. Rose's laugh turned into a coughing fit. Lucy immediately offered water and adjusted pillows with practiced care. I'm beyond medical attention, son, Rose said. The doctors gave me 3 months, 6 months ago. She smiled at Lucy with infinite tenderness. But this angel has been taking care of me. Tom looked around, noting the organized supplies, empty food containers, water jugs. Lucy had indeed been managing her grandmother's care with remarkable competence. How old are you, Lucy? 7 3/4. I'll be 8 on Christmas Day. 7 years old, caring for a terminally ill adult in an abandoned church. Tom felt sick thinking about the responsibility this child carried, but also amazed by her resilience. Rose, how do you know my wife's name? Rose's eyes softened with compassion. Sarah visited me many times during her treatments at the county hospital. She had such a gift for making people feel less alone. Rose reached for Tom's hand. She talked about you constantly, how much she loved you, how worried she was about leaving you alone. Tom felt the world shift. Sarah had never mentioned meeting other patients. She'd always insisted her appointments were routine. She came here 3 times, Lucy said quietly. She brought food and medicine for Grandma Rose, and she prayed with us. That's impossible, Tom whispered, but he knew it was true. It would be just like Sarah to seek out others who needed comfort. "She left something for you," Rose said, gesturing toward a wooden crate. Lucy retrieved a sealed envelope bearing Tom's name in Sarah's familiar handwriting. "She made me promise to give this to you when the time was right," Rose explained. "She said you'd find us when you were ready to understand." Tom stared at the envelope, trembling. "What happened to Lucy's parents?" Rose's expression grew sad. "Car accident 2 years ago. Lucy's daddy was my grandson. After they died, social services tried foster care, but Lucy kept running back to me. The foster families were nice," Lucy added, "but they weren't family, and Grandma Rose needed me." Tom understood why they were hiding. Lucy sacrificed safety to stay with her only family, and Rose was determined to spend her final days with her granddaughter. "Sarah made me promise to tell you something," Rose said, her voice weakening. "She said when you found us, you'd be angry that she kept secrets. But she wanted you to understand that taking care of other people was how she dealt with her own." Fear. Understanding crashed over Tom. All those afternoons when Sarah claimed routine appointments, she'd been creating a secret ministry to dying patients, finding purpose in service even as her own time grew short. "Why me?" Tom asked. Rose smiled. "Because Sarah said you were the kindest man she'd ever known, even though you'd forgotten how to be kind to yourself. She said you needed to learn that taking care of people wasn't just your job, it was your calling." Lucy moved to Tom's side, her small hand touching his arm with surprising gentleness. "Grandma Rose is going to die soon," she said with the blunt honesty that children brought to difficult truths. "But before she does, she wants to make sure someone will take care of me the way she did. Someone who understands about love and loss and not giving up on people." Tom looked into Lucy's dark eyes and saw the reflection of his own pain, but also something he'd lost sight of during the months since Sarah's death. Hope. This 7-year-old girl had faced losses that would break many adults, yet she'd channeled her grief into caring for someone else. She'd found purpose in service, just as Sarah had. The parallel was impossible to ignore, and Tom realized that his encounter with Lucy and Rose wasn't coincidence. It was Sarah's final gift to him, a reminder of who he'd been before grief had made him forget, and a glimpse of who he could become again. As Tom sat in the flickering candlelight of the abandoned church basement, holding Sarah's letter in his trembling hands, he felt something shift inside his chest. The numbing fog that had surrounded him for months began to lift, replaced by a sharp clarity that was both painful and liberating. Here was a child who needed protection, an elderly woman who deserved dignity in her final days, and a mystery about his beloved wife that demanded understanding. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, Tom Mitchell felt the stirring of purpose beyond mere survival. Lucy's small hand remained on his arm, offering comfort with the unconscious generosity that defined true compassion. Rose watched him with knowing eyes, as if she could see the transformation beginning in his soul. The weight of decision pressed upon him. He could follow a protocol called social services, remove Lucy from this situation, ensure Rose received proper medical care in a sterile facility where she would die among strangers. Or he could trust in something larger than regulations and procedures, something that Sarah had understood long before her death. Tom looked at the envelope in his hands, then at Lucy's trusting face, then at Rose's peaceful expression despite her obvious pain. In that moment, he made a choice that would change everything that followed, a choice to listen to his heart rather than his training, to honor love over law. "What do you need?" he asked quietly, and both Lucy and Rose understood that Officer Tom Mitchell had just committed himself to their cause. Whatever the consequences might be, Tom returned to his truck that night with his mind churning and Sarah's unopened letter tucked safely in his jacket pocket. He'd promised Lucy and Rose he would come back the next evening with supplies, but he hadn't told them about the decision weighing on his conscience, whether to report there situation to the proper authorities. The drive home took him past the Cedar Falls Police Department, where the night shift dispatcher would be handling routine calls and Sheriff Martinez would be long gone. Tom pulled into the parking lot and sat in his truck, staring at the building where he'd spent 3 decades, building a reputation for following procedure and doing things by the book. His radio crackled with Carol's voice conducting the shift. "Change. Unit 7. You're clear for the evening. Everything okay out there?" "All clear," Tom responded, though nothing felt clear anymore. "See you tomorrow." At home, the empty house felt different, somehow less like a tomb and more like a place where important decisions needed to be made. Tom sat at his kitchen table with the letter, a cup of coffee, and Rose's crumpled medical records that Lucy had insisted he take. The papers told a story of bureaucratic failure and systemic neglect that made his stomach turn. Rose Washington, age 71, diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 6 months earlier. No living relatives listed except for one minor grandchild. Patient had been receiving palliative care through county services until she failed to appear for scheduled appointments in August. Caseworker noted that attempts to locate patient and minor child had been unsuccessful. File marked pending investigation. Tom realized that Lucy and Rose had been living in that church basement for nearly 3 months without anyone in the system bothering to conduct a serious search. A 7-year-old girl was providing round-the-clock care for a dying woman, and the agencies designed to help had simply written them off as another administrative problem. He opened Sarah's letter with shaking hands, immediately recognizing her. Careful script. "My dearest Tom," it began. "If you're reading this, then Rose has given it to you as I asked, which means you found them and you understand why I had to keep this part of my journey private. I know you're angry with me. I can almost see that crease between your eyebrows that appears when you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't have an easy answer." Tom touched his forehead involuntarily, amazed that Sarah could know him so well, even from beyond the grave. "During my treatments, I met so many people who were dying alone. Not just physically alone, but spiritually isolated, forgotten by families, abandoned by systems, facing their final days without dignity or comfort. I couldn't save myself, my love, but I discovered I could offer something precious to others. In the same situation, I could remind them that they mattered." The letter went on to describe Sarah's visits to terminal patients throughout the county, her growing friendship with Rose, and her deep concern for Lucy's future. She wrote about finding purpose in service, about how helping others had transformed her own fear into something resembling peace. Rose and Lucy will need someone to advocate for them, someone who understands that love is more important than regulation. I thought of you immediately, not because you're a police officer, but because you have the most compassionate heart of anyone I've ever known. You just need to remember how to trust it again. Tom read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it beside his coffee cup. Sarah had orchestrated this meeting from her deathbed, knowing that he would need something larger than his own grief to find his way back to life. She'd also understood that Lucy and Rose would need an ally with enough authority to protect them from a system that had already failed them once. The next morning, Tom arrived at work 30 minutes early and found Sheriff Martinez in his office reviewing incident reports from the night shift. Miguel looked up with genuine concern as Tom knocked on the doorframe. "You look like you didn't sleep much," Martinez observed. "Everything all right?" Tom closed the office door and took a seat across from his friend's desk. In 30 years of partnership, he'd never lied to Miguel Martinez, and he wasn't about to start now. But he also wasn't ready to reveal the full extent of his involvement with Lucy and Rose. "I need to ask you about our policy regarding elderly welfare checks and minor children in potentially unsafe situations." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "That's pretty specific. Are we talking about a current case?" "Hypothetically," Tom said carefully. What's our obligation when we encounter a situation where proper intervention might cause more harm than good? Tom, there's no such thing as proper intervention causing harm. If a child is in danger, we call social services. If an elderly person needs medical attention, we ensure they get it. You know this. Tom nodded but pressed on. What if the child is actually providing competent care for the elderly person? What if separating them would essentially amount to a death sentence for both psychological for the child, physical for the adult? Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying Tom's face with the sharp intelligence that had made him an excellent sheriff. This isn't hypothetical, is it? You found something last night during that welfare check. Tom felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could confess everything now, let Martinez handle the situation through proper channels, and watch as Lucy and Rose were separated by a system that would prioritize procedure over compassion. Or he could trust in Sarah's wisdom and buy time to find a better solution. I'm still gathering information, Tom said finally. I wanted to understand our options before making any official reports. Martinez's expression softened with understanding. Tom, I know you've been struggling since Sarah passed. Grief can make us want to fix things that aren't necessarily broken, or see problems where solutions already exist. Whatever you found, we'll handle it properly. That's what we do. Tom nodded and stood to leave, but Martinez called after him. Just remember that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is trust the system, even when it feels impersonal. Social services exists for good reasons. Tom spent the morning on routine patrol, but his mind kept returning to Lucy's small hands, adjusting Rose's pillows and the quiet dignity with which both of them faced their impossible situation. He thought about Sarah's letter and her belief that love was more important than regulation. He thought about the crumpled medical records that showed how thoroughly the system had already abandoned this family. During his lunch break, Tom drove to Murphy's hardware store and purchased supplies batteries for Lucy's flashlight, warmer blankets, canned goods that didn't require cooking, bottled water, and basic medical supplies. Old Mr. Murphy rang up the purchases with curious glances, but didn't ask questions. Helping out a neighbor? Murphy asked conversationally. Something like that, Tom replied. The afternoon passed slowly, with Tom counting hours until his evening shift would allow him to return to St. Mary's. He handled 2 minor traffic stops, responded to a noise complaint that turned out to be teenagers playing basketball, and filed paperwork that felt increasingly meaningless compared to the life-and-death situation waiting for him in that church basement dot as dusk approached. Tom loaded the supplies into his patrol car and drove towards St. Mary's with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He was crossing a line that 30 years of training had taught him never to cross, but Sarah's words echoed in his mind. You have the most compassionate heart of anyone I've ever known. You just need to remember how to trust it again. Lucy was waiting for him at the side entrance, as if she'd been watching for his arrival. Her face lit up with relief when she saw the bags of supplies. Grandma Rose has been asking about you all day, Lucy said, leading him down the familiar stone steps. She's weaker today, but she wants to show you something. The basement felt warmer somehow, perhaps because Tom was no longer seeing it as a problem to be solved, but as a home that 2 people had created against impossible odds. Rose was propped up in her makeshift bed, her breathing more labored than the night before, but her eyes bright with anticipation. Officer Mitchell, she said softly, Lucy told me you brought supplies. That's very kind, but it's not why I asked her to find you. Tom knelt beside her bed, noting how her condition had deteriorated in just 24 hours. What can I do for you, Rose? Rose gestured weakly toward the wooden crate that served as her knitstand. In there, you'll find a folder. Papers from the county social services office. Lucy retrieved the folder and handed it to Tom. Inside, he found copies of custody documents, foster care applications, and medical records that painted a picture of bureaucratic incompetence and systemic failure. Lucy had been placed in 3 different foster homes over the past 2 years, running away from each one to return to Rose. Social services had repeatedly attempted to place Rose in a county nursing facility, but she had refused treatment rather than be separated from her granddaughter. "They gave up on us," Rose said simply. "Decided we were too much trouble, too complicated for their procedures. But Lucy and we found a way to stay together." Tom studied the documents, his anger growing with each page. Lucy had been labeled as a difficult placement and flight risk. Rose had been classified as non-compliant and unable to provide adequate care. The bureaucratic language disguised the human reality: a child who refused to abandon her dying grandmother, and an elderly woman who chose dignity over safety. "What do you want from me?" Tom asked. Rose reached for his hand with surprising strength. "I want you to promise me that when I die, you won't let them put Lucy back into the system that's already failed her. She needs someone who understands. That family isn't always about blood sometimes. It's about choice." Tom felt the full weight of what Rose was asking. She wanted him to become Lucy's guardian, to take responsibility for a child he'd known for less than 2 days. It was impossible, impractical, and potentially career-ending. "Rose, I don't know anything about raising children." "Neither did I when Lucy came to me," Rose replied. "But love teaches you what you need to know." Lucy moved to Tom's side, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. "I know it's a lot to ask," she said quietly. "But Grandma Rose says you have the same kind of heart that Sarah had. She says you understand about taking care of people, even when it's hard." Tom looked at these 2 people who had somehow become the center of his world in less than 24 hours. He thought about Sarah's letter, about her belief that his calling was to care for others, about the empty house that awaited him each evening. "Let me think about it," he said finally, and Rose smiled as if his non-refusal was itself a kind of promise. Tom spent the next 3 days visiting St. Mary's each evening, bringing supplies and slowly learning the rhythms of Lucy and Rose's carefully constructed life. What amazed him most wasn't the hardship they endured, but the grace with which they faced each day. Lucy had created routines that would impress a trained nurse: medication schedules, meal planning, even simple physical therapy exercises she'd learned from watching hospital staff during Rose's earlier treatments. On Thursday evening, Tom arrived to find Lucy reading aloud from a worn copy of Little House on the Prairie, while Rose listened with closed eyes and a peaceful expression. The scene reminded him so powerfully of Sarah reading to her elementary school students that he had to pause at the bottom of the stairs, overwhelmed by memory and possibility. "That's one of my favorites," Tom said, settling into his usual spot beside Rose's makeshift bed. Sarah used to read those books to her students every year. Lucy's face lit up with interest. "Tell me about her." "About Sarah." For the first time since the funeral, Tom found himself talking about his wife without the crushing weight of grief overwhelming the words. He told Lucy about Sarah's work at the elementary school library, her love of gardening, the way she hummed while cooking dinner. Rose listened with knowing smiles, occasionally adding details about their conversations during those secret hospital visits. "She worried about you so much," Rose said during a quiet moment. "Not because she thought you couldn't survive without her, but because she was afraid you'd forgotten how to live." Tom understood the distinction now. He'd been surviving for 6 months, going through motions, fulfilling obligations, marking time until retirement. But living required something more, something he'd only begun to rediscover in this unlikely basement sanctuary. "Can I ask you something?" Lucy said, setting down her book. "What made you decide to become a police officer?" Tom considered the question, surprised to realize he hadn't thought about his original motivations in years. "I wanted to help people. Simple as that. Growing up, I saw how much difference one person could make when they chose to get involved, instead of looking the other way." "That's what Sarah said," Lucy replied with matter-of-fact certainty. "She said you chose to be a police officer because you have a protecting heart." The phrase struck Tom with unexpected force. A protecting heart, not just someone who followed rules or enforced laws, but someone whose instincts naturally turned toward shielding others from harm. It had been true once, before years of bureaucracy and disappointment had calcified his idealism into mere competence. On Friday morning, Tom found himself in an unexpected conversation with Dr. Patricia Wells, the grief counselor Sheriff Martinez had mentioned. She approached him in the department break room, introducing herself with the kind of gentle directness that suggested extensive experience with reluctant patients. "Sheriff Martinez mentioned you might benefit from talking with someone about your recent loss," Dr. Wells said, settling into the chair across from him. "I wanted you to know that I'm available whenever you feel ready." Tom studied her face, mid-50s, intelligent eyes, the kind of contained compassion that came from years of listening to people's pain. Under normal circumstances, he would have politely declined and found an excuse to leave. But his conversations with Lucy and Rose had stirred something that made him more open to unexpected connections. "What will we talk about?" Tom asked. "Whatever. You need to explore. Grief doesn't follow a schedule or a prescribed path. Sometimes people find that talking through their feelings helps them process change and discover new directions." Tom found himself describing his recent encounters, carefully omitting specific details about Lucy and Rose's situation, but exploring his growing sense that his life needed to change direction. Dr. Wells listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions that helped him articulate feelings he'd been struggling to understand. "It sounds like you're experiencing what we call post-traumatic growth," she said, toward the end of their conversation. "Sometimes profound loss creates opportunities for people to rediscover parts of themselves they'd forgotten or to find new purposes they hadn't previously considered. Is that normal? It's not uncommon, especially for people who've spent their careers in service to others. The question is whether you're willing to trust what you're feeling, even if it leads you in unexpected directions." Tom left the conversation, feeling oddly lighter, as if someone had given him permission to consider possibilities he'd been afraid to acknowledge. That evening, he arrived at St. Mary's with a new sense of clarity about the decision Rose had asked him to make. He found Lucy in the basement's makeshift kitchen area, carefully preparing what appeared to be soup from canned ingredients. Rose was sleeping fitfully, her breathing more labored than he'd heard before. "How long has she been like this?" Tom asked. "Since this morning," Lucy replied, stirring the soup with practiced competence. "She has good days and bad days. Today is not so good." Tom knelt beside Rose's bed, noting the grayish pallor of her skin and the way her chest rose and fell with obvious effort. His experience with Sarah's final weeks told him that Rose's time was running short days rather than weeks. "Lucy," he said gently, "we need to talk about what happens next." Lucy set down her spoon and joined him beside Rose's bed. For a 7-year-old, she had remarkable composure when discussing difficult topics, but Tom could see the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "I know she's dying," Lucy said quietly. "She's been preparing me for it, but I don't want to go back to foster care. I don't want to live with strangers who don't understand about family." Tom took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a decision that would change everything. What if you didn't have to go back to foster care? What if there was another option? Hope flickered in Lucy's dark eyes, but she was too intelligent to assume anything. "What kind of option? What if you came to live with me?" The words hung in the basement air like a prayer and a promise combined. Lucy stared at him with the intensity of someone trying to determine whether she dared to believe what she was hearing. "You mean it? You really want me?" Tom felt his heart breaking and healing simultaneously at the vulnerability in her voice. This child had been abandoned by systems and disappointed by adults enough times to doubt even the most sincere offers of help. "I mean it," Tom said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "I think Sarah would have wanted it this way. And I think you and I could take care of each other." Lucy threw her arms around his neck with the fierce gratitude of someone who had learned not to expect miracles, but recognized one when it appeared. Tom held her small frame and felt something settle into place in his chest, not the absence of grief, but the presence of purpose alongside it. Rose stirred in her sleep and opened her eyes, as if some sixth sense had alerted her to the conversation taking place beside her bed. "Did I hear what I think I heard?" she whispered. "Tom wants me to live with him," Lucy said, her voice bright with barely contained excitement. "He wants to be my family." Rose's smile transformed her pain-worn features into something approaching radiance. "I knew Sarah was right about you," she said to Tom. "I knew you'd remember who you were meant to be." Tom felt the truth of those words settling into his bones. For 6 months, he'd been a man going through the motions of living. Now, sitting in an abandoned church basement with a dying woman and a brave little girl, he was remembering what it meant to choose life over mere survival. "There are legal issues to work through," Tom said, his mind already turning to practical considerations. "Custody proceedings, background checks, home inspections. It won't be simple." "The best things never are," Rose replied with the wisdom of someone who had learned to find joy in complexity. "But Sarah taught me that love finds a way, especially when people are willing to fight for it." Tom looked at Lucy's hopeful face and Rose's peaceful expression and felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's diagnosis: confidence in the future. Not certainty about outcomes, but faith that whatever came next would be worth facing together. Outside the basement windows, October wind rattled the old church's bones, but inside their makeshift sanctuary, 3 people had found something precious in each other. Tom Mitchell was no longer just surviving his grief. He was transforming it into something that could nurture new life and new love. As Rose drifted back to sleep and Lucy returned to her soup preparation, Tom opened Sarah's Bible, the one Lucy had somehow acquired, and found a passage underlined. "In his wife's familiar hand, he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." Tom was beginning to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting or moving on. It meant allowing broken places to become spaces where new love could take root and grow. The weekend brought unseasonably warm October weather, and Tom found himself spending Saturday afternoon at the Cedar Falls Public Library, researching guardianship laws and adoption procedures. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had known Sarah well and approached him with gentle curiosity about his sudden interest in child welfare law. "Research for a case?" she asked, setting a stack of legal reference books on his table. "Something like that," Tom replied, which had become his standard response to questions he wasn't ready to answer fully. The legal requirements were more complex than he'd hoped, but not impossible. As an unmarried man seeking guardianship of an unrelated minor, he would face additional scrutiny, background investigations, and home inspections. The process could take months, and there was no guarantee of success. Meanwhile, Lucy would need temporary placement, which likely meant the foster care system she was so desperate to avoid. Tom was deep in reading about emergency custody procedures when his phone rang. Carol's voice carried unusual urgency. "Tom, I'm sorry to bother you on your day off, but Sheriff Martinez wants to see you. Says it's important." Tom's stomach dropped. Had someone reported his visits to St. Mary's? Had Lucy and Rose been discovered by social services? Did he say what it's about? Something about a welfare check report that needs clarification. "Can you come in?" Tom drove to the station with growing dread, mentally preparing explanations that wouldn't implicate Lucy and Rose Weil wouldn't technically be lies. Sheriff Martinez was waiting in his office with a thick file folder and an expression Tom couldn't read. "Close the door and have a seat," Martinez said without preamble. "We need to talk about your activities this week." Tom felt his career potentially ending before his eyes, but he kept his voice steady. "What activities?" Martinez opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be a comprehensive investigation report. "Tuesday night, you conducted a welfare check that lasted nearly 2 hours. Wednesday through Friday, you made purchases at Murphy's Hardware that suggest you're providing supplies to someone in need. You've been visiting a location on the east side of town every evening after your shift." Tom stared at the documents, realizing that his movements had been tracked more carefully than he'd imagined. "Are you having me followed?" "Tom, you've been a different person this week. More focused, more purposeful, but also secretive in ways that aren't like you." Carol noticed at first said, "You seemed like you'd found something important but weren't ready to share it." When unusual behavior coincides with off-the-books welfare checks, I have to pay attention. Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "I'm not trying to end your career here. I'm trying to understand what's going on so I can help you handle it properly." Tom made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. "I need to show you something, but I want your word that you'll hear the whole story before making any official reports." "Tom, your word." "Miguel. As my friend, not just my supervisor." Martinez studied Tom's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have it, but this better be good." 30 minutes later, Tom led Martinez down the stone steps into St. Mary's basement. Lucy heard them coming and moved protectively toward Rose's bed, her small frame radiating fierce loyalty despite her obvious fear. "It's okay," Tom said gently. "This is Sheriff Martinez. He's here to help." Martinez stood in the basement doorway, taking in the makeshift living arrangement with the trained eye of someone who'd seen countless difficult situations. But Tom watched his expression change from professional assessment to something approaching wonder as he observed the obvious care and dignity that defined this unlikely home. Rose was awake and alert, despite her weakening condition. She studied Martinez with intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through to his character. "You must be Miguel," she said softly. "Sarah mentioned you many times. She said you were Tom's closest friend and a man who understood the difference between justice and law." Martinez looked sharply at Tom, who realized Rose had just revealed another piece of Sarah's secret life that he hadn't known about. "Ma'am," Martinez said respectfully, "I'm trying to understand this situation. Officer Mitchell tells me you've been living here for several months." "Lucy and I have been making do," Rose replied with quiet dignity. "We understand that our arrangement isn't conventional, but it's what we need." Martinez spent the next hour listening to their story, Lucy's journey through failed foster placements, Rose's determination to spend her final days with her granddaughter, the bureaucratic failures that had led them to this basement sanctuary. Lucy answered his questions with remarkable poise, explaining her caregiving routines and her fears about being separated from Rose. When Martinez finally spoke, his voice was careful and measured. "This is an impossible situation from a legal standpoint. You're essentially homeless squatters in a condemned building, providing inadequate care for a terminally ill patient and endangering a minor child." Tom felt his heart sink, but Martinez continued. "It's also the most extraordinary example of love and commitment I've encountered in 25 years of law enforcement. This child is providing better care for her grandmother than most nursing facilities, and they've created something here that transcends their circumstances." Martinez looked at Tom with new understanding. "Sarah connected you to them, didn't she? This isn't coincidence." Tom nodded, pulling Sarah's letter from his jacket pocket. "She left this for me. She knew I'd need something to remind me who I was supposed to be." Martinez read the letter in silence, his expression growing thoughtful. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to Tom. "What do you want to do?" Martinez asked. "I want to become Lucy's guardian. I want to give Rose the dignity of dying surrounded by people who love her. And I want to honor what Sarah was trying to tell me about the difference between serving the law and serving justice." Martinez was quiet for several minutes, studying the three faces watching him expectantly. Finally, he spoke to Rose directly. "Ma'am, how much time do your doctors think you have?" "Days, maybe a week," Rose replied honestly. "I can feel my body letting go. I'm not afraid of dying, Sheriff Martinez. I'm only afraid of leaving Lucy alone in a system that's already failed her." Martinez nodded slowly, then turned to Tom. "Here's what we're going to do. Officially, I never saw this place or these people. Unofficially, you have 1 week to get Rose proper medical support and begin legal proceedings for Lucy's custody. After that, I can't pretend I don't know about a situation that puts a child at risk." Tom felt a surge of gratitude toward his friend. "What about the department? What about protocol?" "Sometimes protocol serves justice, and sometimes it doesn't," Martinez replied. "Sarah was right about me understanding the difference. But Tom, you need to be prepared for what comes next. Taking custody of Lucy won't be simple, and not everyone will understand why you're doing it." "I understand the risks," Tom said, "but I also understand that some things are worth risking everything for." Martinez smiled for the first time since entering the basement. That sounds like something Sarah would have said. As they prepared to leave, Lucy approached Martinez with the serious expression she wore when discussing important matters. "Sheriff Martinez," she said formally, "thank you for not taking me away from Grandma Rose, and thank you for understanding that Tom is good people." Martinez knelt to her eye level, his voice gentle. "You're welcome, Lucy, and you're right about Tom. He's some of the best people I know." Driving back to the station, Martinez was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke without taking his eyes off. "The road. You know this is going to change everything, right? Your career, your life, your future. Nothing will be the same." Tom thought about the empty house waiting for him, the retirement he'd been counting down to, the predictable routine that had been slowly suffocating his spirit. "Good," he said. Simply, "I'm ready for everything to change." Martinez nodded with understanding. "Sarah would be proud of you. She'd also probably remind you that the hardest part is just beginning." Tom knew his friend was right. The legal battles, the bureaucratic challenges, the skepticism of colleagues who might question his judgment, all of that lay ahead. But for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt truly alive, truly purposeful, truly himself. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Tom's radio crackled with a routine call about a minor traffic accident. He looked at the radio, then at Martinez, and felt the strange sensation of his old life and his new purpose existing simultaneously in the same moment. "Unit 7 responding," he said into the radio, and drove toward whatever came next with a sense of anticipation rather than mere duty. Tom spent Sunday morning making calls that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. Dr. Patricia Wells had given him the number of a family court attorney who specialized in emergency custody cases. Social worker Ellen Martinez, Sheriff Martinez's sister-in-law, agreed to meet with him Monday morning to discuss the fastest path through the bureaucratic maze that stood between Lucy and a stable home. But first, he had to face the conversation he'd been dreading since making his commitment to Lucy, telling his colleagues about his decision to seek guardianship of a child they'd never heard him mention. Carol Henderson was watering plants in the department's front office when Tom arrived for his Monday morning shift. She looked up with the motherly concern that had comforted 3 decades of officers through various personal crises. "You look like a man with something weighing on his mind." she observed. Tom poured coffee from the pot. Carol kept perpetually brewing and took a seat across from her desk. Carol, can I ask you something? What do you know about adoption and guardianship? Procedures? Carol set down her watering can with obvious interest. Quite a bit, actually. My daughter went through it when she adopted my grandson from foster care. Why? Are you thinking about children? The directness of the question caught Tom off guard, but Carol's genuine interest made him realize he needed to start trusting people with his story. I'm thinking about a specific child, a 7-year-old girl who needs a home. Carol's face lit up with unexpected delight. Tom Mitchell, are you telling me you're considering becoming a father at 52? I'm telling you, I've met a little girl who needs someone to fight for her, and I think I might be that someone. Carol studied his face with the intuitive wisdom that came from decades of reading people. This isn't just about helping a child, is it? This is about you finding something you didn't know you were looking for. Tom nodded, surprised by how accurately she'd captured his feelings. Her name is Lucy. She's been taking care of her dying grandmother in impossible circumstances, and she's about to be thrown back into a foster care system that's already failed her multiple times. Where did you meet her? Tom told Carol an abbreviated version of the story, watching her expression shift from curiosity to concern to deep admiration. When he finished, Carol was wiping tears from her eyes. That child led you to exactly what Sarah wanted you to find, Carol said with absolute certainty. Purpose, family, a reason to believe in tomorrow again. The rest of Tom's shift passed in a blur of routine calls and paperwork, but his mind was focused on the afternoon appointment with Ellen Martinez. The social worker met him at a coffee shop on Main Street, bringing a briefcase full of forms and a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic red tape when children's welfare was at stake. Ellen was younger than Tom had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of practical energy that suggested extensive experience managing impossible caseloads. She listened to Lucy and Rose's story with professional attention, asking detailed questions about living conditions, medical care, and Lucy's emotional stability. The good news is that emergency custody situations can move quickly when there's imminent risk to a child's welfare, Ellen explained. The challenging news is that a single older male seeking guardianship of an unrelated female child will face additional scrutiny. What kind of scrutiny? Background checks, psychological evaluations, home inspections, character references. The court will want to ensure you understand the long-term commitment involved in raising a traumatized child who's already lost multiple caregivers. Tom felt daunted by the process, but not deterred. How long does it typically take? In emergency situations, we can get temporary custody within days if the child's current placement is deemed unsafe. Long-term guardianship can take months, but if the temporary placement is working well, courts tend to favor stability. Ellen pulled several forms from her briefcase. I'll need you to fill these out and return them by Wednesday. I'll also need character references from colleagues, medical records, financial statements, and a detailed home inspection. Tom looked at the stack of paperwork and felt a moment of panic. The process seemed designed to discourage anyone but the most determined applicants. Ellen, he said carefully, what happens to Lucy during this process? Where does she live while we wait for court approval? That's the difficult part. Technically, she should be placed in emergency foster care immediately. However, if we can demonstrate that her current caregiver, you, is providing adequate temporary supervision while official proceedings move forward, the court sometimes allows alternative arrangements. Tom understood the subtext. Lucy could stay with him informally while they navigated the legal system, but only if no one in authority objected to the arrangement. That evening, Tom arrived at St. Mary's with legal paperwork and a sense of urgency that hadn't existed before. Rose's condition had deteriorated noticeably since the weekend. Her breathing was more labored, her periods of sleep longer and deeper. Lucy met him at the basement entrance with obvious worry in her dark eyes. "She's been asking for you," Lucy sighed quietly. "I think she wants to talk about what happens next." Tom found Rose propped against pillows, her face gray with exhaustion, but her eyes still alert. She smiled when she saw him, though the effort seemed to cost her considerable energy. "Tom," she whispered, "how did your meetings go today?" Tom pulled a chair close to her makeshift bed and described his conversations with Ellen Martinez and the legal requirements they faced. Rose listened with the focused attention of someone making important decisions about limited time. "How long do you think I have?" she asked directly. Tom had learned enough about her condition to recognize the signs. "Days, Rose. Maybe a week if you're lucky." Rose nodded as if this confirmed what she already knew. "Then we need to move quickly. Lucy needs to be legally protected before I die, or the system will take her immediately. I'm working on it. Ellen Martinez thinks we can get emergency custody if we can demonstrate that Lucy's current placement with me is safe and stable." "What does that mean practically?" Tom took a deep breath, realizing he was about to propose something that violated every protocol he'd spent 30 years following. "It means Lucy needs to come home with me tonight. Officially, she'd be staying with a family friend while waiting for foster placement. Unofficially, she'd be starting the process of becoming my daughter." Lucy, who had been listening from across the basement, approached with the serious expression she wore when processing important information. "Would I have to leave Grandma Rose alone?" she asked. Tom felt his heart break at the question. Lucy was willing to sacrifice her own safety and future to avoid abandoning Rose in her final days. "No," Tom said firmly. "We'll arrange for hospice care here. Medical professionals who understand that Rose wants to die in peace, surrounded by people who love her." Rose's eyes filled with tears of relief. "You would do that? You would let her stay here until you're ready to go," Tom finished gently. "And then Lucy comes home with me, and we figure out how to be a family together." Lucy moved to Rose's bedside and took her grandmother's thin hand. "What do you think, Grandma Rose? Should I go home with Tom?" Rose looked at Tom with an expression that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "I think Sarah knew exactly what she was doing when she brought you two together. I think you're going to take care of each other in ways neither of you expects." Tom felt the truth of those words settling into his bones. This wasn't just about him helping Lucy or honoring Sarah's memory. This was about two people who had lost everything finding a way to build something new together. "There's one more thing," Rose said, her voice growing weaker. "In that wooden crate, there's a photo album. Lucy's parents, her baby pictures, family, history. She'll need those someday, when she's ready to remember where she came from." Tom retrieved the album, feeling the weight of generations in his hands. Lucy's family history, her connection to parents and grandparents, the story of how she'd become the remarkable child she was. "And this," Rose added, touching the wooden cross around Lucy's neck. "Her grandfather carved it for her when she was born. Promise me she'll always have it." "I promise," Tom said, understanding that he was accepting more than legal guardianship. He was becoming the keeper of Lucy's history, the bridge between her past and her future. As night settled over Cedar Falls, Tom made arrangements that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He called the county hospice service and explained Rose's situation, emphasizing her desire to die with dignity in familiar surroundings. He contacted Ellen Martinez about emergency custody procedures. He even called Dr. Patricia Wells, asking for guidance about helping a grieving child transition to a new home. Most importantly, he went home and prepared Sarah's old craft room to become Lucy's bedroom, filling it with books and art supplies and hope for tomorrow dawn when he returned to St. Mary's the next morning. Lucy was waiting with a small duffel bag containing her few possessions and an expression of nervous excitement. "Are you ready?" Tom asked. Lucy looked at Rose, who was sleeping peacefully with the assistance of medication the hospice nurse had provided overnight. "I'm ready," Lucy said quietly. "Grandma Rose says this is what Sarah wanted, for us to take care of each other." Tom took Lucy's hand as they walked up the basement stairs toward his truck. Behind them, Rose rested in the makeshift sanctuary they'd created together. Ahead of them lay the uncertain process of becoming a family. "Tom," Lucy said as they reached the truck, "thank you for not giving up on us." Tom looked down at this brave, resilient child who had somehow become the center of his world in less than 2 weeks. "Thank you for reminding me who I wanted to be," he replied, and meant every word. Tom woke up on Wednesday morning to the sound of Lucy making breakfast in his kitchen, a scene so normal it felt miraculous. She'd adapted to his house with remarkable ease, organizing her few belongings in Sarah's former craft room and establishing routines that somehow made the empty space feel like a home again. The hospice nurse called, Lucy said, setting a plate of scrambled eggs before him with the serious efficiency that defined all her caregiving efforts. "Grandma Rose had a peaceful night, but she's asking for us." Tom had visited Rose every evening since Lucy moved in, but today felt different. The hospice nurse had warned them that Rose's condition was declining rapidly, and her lucid moments were becoming fewer and farther between. They arrived at St. Mary's to find Rose propped against pillows, her breathing shallow but her eyes bright with the particular clarity that sometimes preceded death. She smiled when she saw them, though the effort seemed to exhaust her. "My 2 favorite people," she whispered. "How are you settling in, Lucy?" "Tom's teaching me to make pancakes," Lucy replied, settling beside Rose's bed with practiced gentleness. "And he has a whole room just for books. More books than I've ever seen in one house." Rose looked at Tom with grateful eyes. "Sarah always said you had enough love in your heart for a dozen children. She just wasn't sure you knew it yourself." Tom felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Rose revealed another piece of Sarah's hidden thoughts. "What else did she tell you about me?" Rose's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were deciding whether to share something important. "She told me about the box in your bedroom closet. The one you've never opened since she died." Tom went cold. He'd forgotten that Sarah had mentioned that box to anyone. After the funeral, well-meaning friends and family had sorted through most of Sarah's belongings, but Tom had packed away her most personal items, letters, photographs, journals, in a sealed box he couldn't bear to examine. She said there were things in there you'd need to understand when you were ready to move forward instead of just survive. Lucy looked between Tom and Rose with the perceptive intelligence that seemed to see straight through adult complications. "What kind of things?" Rose reached for Tom's hand with surprising strength. Sarah kept detailed records of her visits to dying patients, names, stories, connections she made. She also wrote letters, lots of letters to people she thought might need guidance or support after she was gone. Tom felt the world shifting beneath him again. "What kind of letters?" "Letters to you, for different stages of your grief. Letters to Lucy, for when she was older and might want to understand how their lives connected. Letters to other patients' families, offering comfort and suggesting ways they might help each other." The implications crashed over Tom like a wave. Sarah hadn't just orchestrated his meeting with Lucy and Rose. She'd created an entire network of connections designed to help grieving people find each other and build new forms of family and support. "How many letters?" Tom asked. "Dozens, maybe more." She spent her final weeks writing, planning, asking me to help her understand which connections might work and how to make them happen. Rose's voice was growing weaker, but her message was urgent. "Tom, you and Lucy aren't the only ones. There are other people Sarah wanted to bring together, other families she thought could heal each other. Tom thought about the sealed box in his closet, about the letters and records it contained, about the scope of what Sarah had been planning during those final weeks. When he thought she was simply receiving routine medical care, she created a ministry, Tom said with dawning understanding. She created hope, Rose corrected gently, for people who thought they'd lost it forever. Lucy moved closer to Tom, her small hand finding his arm with the instinctive comfort she offered whenever she sensed adult distress. What does this mean? Tom looked at this brave little girl who had become his daughter in everything but legal paperwork. Then at Rose, who was peacefully preparing to leave the world and felt the full weight of what Sarah had entrusted to him. It means we have work to do, Tom said quietly. Important work that Sarah started and couldn't finish. Rose smiled with deep satisfaction. She knew you'd understand when the time was right. She knew you'd see that taking care of Lucy was just the beginning. That evening, after spending hours with Rose and ensuring she was comfortable, Tom and Lucy returned home to face the box in the bedroom closet. Lucy sat on the bed while Tom retrieved the sealed container, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Sarah's careful organization was evident immediately. File folders labeled with names and dates, stacks of handwritten letters organized by recipient, detailed notes about patient histories and family situations. At the top of everything, an envelope addressed simply to Tom, "When you're ready to begin." Tom opened the letter with Lucy, watching solemnly beside him. "My dearest Tom," Sarah had written, "if you're reading this, then Rose has given you the guidance I hoped she would. And you've learned that Lucy is only the first of many connections I've tried to arrange. I know this feels overwhelming, and I know you're probably angry with me for keeping so much secret. But I need you to understand that this wasn't about deception. It was about hope." The letter went on to describe Sarah's vision of a network of people who had lost everything finding ways to build new families and support systems together. Elderly patients with no remaining family connected to young parents who needed grandparent figures. Grieving widows and widowers helping each other navigate loss while perhaps finding new companionship. Children aging out of foster care matched with adults who had room in their hearts and homes for unconventional families. I've done the research, made the initial connections, written the letters that explain each situation. All it needs is someone with the courage to act as a bridge between people who need each other but don't know how to find each other. I thought of you immediately, not just because you're a police officer with natural protective instincts, but because you understand what it means to lose everything and still choose to keep loving." Tom looked up to find Lucy watching him with serious eyes. "She wants us to help other people the way we helped each other." "It's bigger than that," Tom said, scanning through the files and seeing names, addresses, detailed plans for dozens of potential connections. "She wants us to help create families for people who thought they'd never have family again." Lucy was quiet for several minutes, processing the scope of what they'd discovered. Finally, she spoke with the practical wisdom that constantly amazed Tom. "Can we do that? Can we really help that many people?" Tom thought about his empty house that had become a home again, about his purposeless retirement that had transformed into a calling, about the grief that had become a foundation for helping others heal. "I think we have to try," Tom said. I think Sarah was counting on us to try." Lucy nodded with the serious acceptance of someone who had learned early that important responsibilities couldn't be avoided simply because they were difficult. "Then, we better get started," she said simply. Tom looked at the files spread across the bed, at the letters Sarah had written to strangers who were about to become part of an extended family they didn't know existed yet, at Lucy's determined expression. For the first time since opening the box, he felt excitement rather than overwhelm. Sarah had given them more than a second chance at family. She'd given them a mission that could transform dozens of lives, and create a legacy of love that would outlast all of them. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The hospice nurse's voice was gentle but urgent. "Mr. Mitchell, you should come. Rose is asking for you and Lucy. I think it's time." Tom looked at Lucy, who was already moving toward her jacket with the calm acceptance that defined her approach to life's hardest moments. "We're coming," Tom said into the phone as they drove through the November darkness towards St. Mary's. Tom realized that Rose's passing would mark not just an ending, but a beginning. The work Sarah had planned, the connections she'd envisioned, the families waiting to be formed, all of it was about to become their responsibility and their privilege. "Tom?" Lucy said quietly as they pulled into the church parking lot. "After Grandma Rose dies, will you still want to keep me?" Tom stopped the truck and turned to face this remarkable child who had already given him more purpose and joy than he'd thought possible. "Lucy, keeping you isn't something I want to do. It's something I need to do. You're not just my responsibility, you're my family. And families don't give up on each other, no matter what comes next." Lucy smiled with the radiant trust of someone who had finally found the security she'd been seeking all her life. "Good," she said simply, "because I think we're going to be very busy helping other families find each other." Tom took her hand as they walked toward the church, knowing that whatever waited for them in that basement, grief, loss, transition, they would face it together, and then use it to help others do the same. Rose passed peacefully at 3 the morning on Thursday, November 15th, with Tom holding one hand and Lucy holding the other. Her final words were whispered to Lucy. "Remember that love never really ends. It just finds new ways to grow." The hospice nurse helped them with the immediate arrangements, but Tom found himself struggling with an unexpected challenge. Rose had no family beyond Lucy, no church community, no established support network to handle funeral arrangements. She had specifically requested cremation and asked that her ashes be scattered in the small garden behind St. Mary's, where she'd spent peaceful hours watching Lucy play during their months in the basement. "We'll give her a proper service," Tom told Lucy as they sat in the church basement one final time, packing the few belongings that had defined their makeshift home. "She deserves to be remembered by people who understand what an extraordinary woman she was." Lucy nodded, dry-eyed but thoughtful in the way that children process grief differently than adults. "Grandma Rose said funerals aren't really for the people who die. They're for the people who need to say goodbye and remember the good things." Tom was constantly amazed by the wisdom that emerged from Lucy's observations about life and death. At 7 years old, she had a more mature understanding of loss and healing than many adults he'd encountered. The funeral arrangements led to Tom's first real test of Sarah's expanded mission. While researching funeral homes, he discovered that Rose had been receiving visits from several other terminal patients. During her final weeks, people she'd met through the county hospital's informal network of long-term patients who supported each other through treatment. When Tom contacted these individuals to inform them of Rose's death, he found himself speaking with people who were facing their own end-of-life challenges with varying degrees of family support. Mrs. Eleanor Hargley, a 68-year-old widow undergoing chemotherapy, had no children and had formed a deep friendship with Rose during their shared treatment sessions. James Chun, a 45-year-old divorced father of 2 teenage children, was struggling with both his cancer diagnosis and his ex-wife's reluctance to let him spend time with his kids during his remaining months. As Tom spoke with each person, he began to see the connections Sarah had envisioned. People who needed each other but had no framework for building relationships beyond chance meetings in hospital waiting rooms. "Would you like to speak at Rose's service?" Tom asked Mrs. Hartley during their conversation. "I would be honored," she replied, then hesitated. "But I should mention that I don't really have anyone to accompany me. My health makes driving difficult." Tom found himself offering transportation, then realized he was beginning to put Sarah's vision into practice without conscious planning. "Mrs. Hartley, would you be interested in meeting some other friends of Rose's who might be facing similar challenges?" The question led to an impromptu gathering at Tom's house the evening before Rose's funeral. Mrs. Hartley arrived with homemade soup and stories about Rose's kindness during chemotherapy sessions. James Chun brought his teenage daughter, Sarah named. He mentioned with surprise, after Tom's wife, who had visited his hospital room several times during his treatment, Lucy moved among the adults with remarkable grace, offering comfort and asking thoughtful questions that helped each person share their memories of Rose and their current struggles. Tom watched her natural ability to connect with people who needed support and realized that Sarah had seen something in Lucy that went far beyond her obvious intelligence and resilience. "Your daughter has an extraordinary gift," Mrs. Hartley told Tom quietly as they prepared coffee in the kitchen. "She makes people feel heard in a way that's quite rare." "She's not my biological daughter," Tom explained, then realized how inadequate that description had become. "But yes, she's remarkable. She's teaching me things about family and love that I never understood before." During the evening, Tom found himself naturally facilitating connections between his guests. Mrs. Hartley mentioned her loneliness and fear about facing treatment alone. James expressed guilt about burdening his children with his illness. His daughter Sarah talked about wanting to help her father but not knowing how to balance her own grief with his needs done by the end of the evening. Mrs. Hartley had offered to accompany James to his next treatment session. James had invited her to join him and his daughter for weekly dinners, and young Sarah had asked if she could visit Lucy to learn more about how to care for someone who was sick. "This is what Grandma Rose meant, isn't it?" Lucy asked Tom as they cleaned up after their guest left. "About families being bigger than just the people you're born with?" Tom looked around his living room, which had hosted more laughter and meaningful conversation in one evening than it had in the 6 months since Sarah's death. "I think this is exactly what both Grandma Rose and Sarah had in mind." Rose's funeral service was held at First Baptist Church, where Pastor Williams had agreed to officiate despite Rose never having been a member of the congregation. Tom had called him to explain the situation, and the pastor had immediately understood the importance of providing dignity and community for someone who had died with grace despite difficult circumstances. The service drew an unexpected crowd. Hospital staff who remembered Rose's gentle kindness to other patients, social workers who had tried unsuccessfully to help her and Lucy navigate the system, neighbors from Rose's former apartment building who had wondered what happened to the kind woman and the well-behaved little girl who had lived there. Sheriff Martinez attended with his wife, offering visible support for Tom's unconventional family situation. Carol Henderson came with homemade flowers and tears for a woman she'd never met but whose story had touched her heart. Dr. Patricia Wells sat in the back row, observing the community that was forming around grief transformed into purpose. When it came time for eulogies, Tom stood at the podium with notes he'd prepared, but found himself speaking from the heart instead. "Rose Washington taught me that family isn't about blood or law or convention," he said, looking out at the assembled faces. "Family is about choosing to show up for each other, especially when showing up is difficult." Rose chose to show up for Lucy every single day, even when she was dying. Lucy chose to show up for Rose, even when she was just a child who should have been someone else's responsibility. He paused, finding Lucy's serious face in the front row, drawing strength from her steady presence. "But Rose and Lucy also taught me that showing up for each other doesn't have to end with death. The love they shared, the example they set, the connections they made, those things continue. They ripple outward to touch people who need to know that they're not alone, that they matter, that someone will show up for them too." After the service, As people gathered for the reception in the church fellowship hall, Tom found himself surrounded by individuals who wanted to know more about Lucy's story, about Rose's life, about how they might help or become involved in similar efforts to support isolated people facing difficult circumstances. Mrs. Hartley approached him with James Chun and his daughter. "Officer Mitchell, we've been talking about what you said during the service, about showing up for each other and creating connections. Is this something that could continue? This bringing people together who need each other?" Tom looked at the expectant faces surrounding him, thinking about the box of letters and files waiting in his bedroom closet, about Sarah's comprehensive vision for healing through connection, about Lucy's natural gift for making people feel valued and heard. "I think it could," Tom said carefully. "I think it should. But it would require commitment from all of us, not just good intentions, but real follow-through on building relationships and supporting each other through difficult times." "What would that look like practically?" James asked. Tom realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just his own future, but Lucy's as well. They could return to their quiet life as a family of two, processing their own grief and building their own relationship. Or they could embrace Sarah's larger vision and commit to the more complex, demanding, and potentially transformative work of helping others find family and healing. It would mean opening our homes and our hearts to people who are struggling, Tom said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. It would mean becoming a community that shows up for each other in practical ways, rides to medical appointments, help with grocery shopping, someone to call in the middle of the night when fear gets overwhelming. It would mean choosing to see strangers as potential family members. Lucy appeared at his side, slipping her small hand into his with the timing that suggested she'd been listening carefully to the entire conversation. It would mean doing what Grandma Rose and Sarah taught us, she said simply. Taking care of people because that's how love works. Tom looked down at this remarkable child who had become his compass for navigating decisions about purpose and meaning. Then back at the group of people who were waiting for his answer about whether hope was really possible. "Then yes," Tom said firmly. "Let's figure out how to make this work." The murmur of agreement and excitement that rippled through the group told Tom that he'd just committed himself and Lucy to something far larger and more challenging than he'd imagined when he first encountered a barefoot little girl asking him to follow her to church. But as he watched the faces around him light up with possibility, Tom realized that Sarah had been right about one crucial thing: taking care of people wasn't just his job. It was his calling, and now it was Lucy's too. The confrontation Tom had been dreading arrived on a gray Monday morning in early December, exactly 3 weeks after Rose's funeral. He was preparing Lucy's breakfast when a knock at the door interrupted their peaceful routine. Through the window, he could see an official county vehicle and 2 women in professional attire carrying briefcases and clipboards. "Stay in the kitchen," Tom told Lucy quietly, recognizing the unmistakable signs of a social services investigation. The lead caseworker introduced herself as Miss Rebecca Foster, a stern-faced woman in her 40s who radiated the kind of bureaucratic authority that brooked no argument. Her companion was Miss Patricia Kellum, a younger woman whose sympathetic expression suggested she might be more amenable to reason. "Officer Mitchell," Miss Foster said without preamble, "we're here regarding Lucy Washington, who our records indicate has been residing with you for the past 3 weeks without proper authorization or legal guardianship approval." Tom felt his carefully constructed world beginning to shift beneath his feet. "I'm in the process of filing for emergency custody. Ellen Martinez has been helping me navigate the legal requirements." "Yes, we're aware of your application, Miss," Foster replied, consulting her clipboard. "However, our investigation has raised several concerns about the appropriateness of this placement." She gestured toward her companion, who opened a thick file folder. We've received reports that you removed a minor child from her previous living situation without proper notification to authorities, that you've been facilitating unauthorized care for a terminally ill adult, and that you're currently operating what appears to be an unlicensed support group for vulnerable individuals in your home. Tom realized that someone had reported their activities to the county, probably a well-meaning observer who didn't understand the complexity of their situation, but felt obligated to ensure proper oversight of child welfare. "Ms. Foster," Tom said carefully, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about Officer Mitchell." She interrupted. "I'm going to need to speak with Lucy privately to assess her current situation and determine whether she's receiving appropriate care." The words Tom had been dreading most. Lucy appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of official voices discussing her future. She looked small and vulnerable in her school clothes, but her expression carried the quiet dignity that had defined her response to every crisis she'd faced. "Are you Lucy Washington?" Ms. Foster asked, her tone shifting to the artificially gentle voice adults used when addressing children they were about to disappoint. "Yes, ma'am," Lucy replied politely. "I'm Ms. Foster from the County Social Services Office. I need to ask you some questions about your living situation here with Officer Mitchell." Lucy looked at Tom with an expression that asked permission, and he nodded encouragingly despite his growing anxiety. "We need to speak privately," Miss Foster said, glancing meaningfully at Tom. "Actually," Miss Kellum interjected quietly, "given the child's age and the nature of our inquiry, it might be more appropriate to conduct the interview in a neutral location where she feels comfortable. Perhaps we could all sit in the living room?" Tom felt grateful for the younger caseworker's sensitivity, but he also understood that this interview would determine Lucy's immediate future. Everything they'd built together, their family, their home, their expanding mission to help others, hung in the balance of how well Lucy could articulate her situation to strangers who were trained to identify problems rather than appreciate solutions. They settled in the living room, where evidence of their unconventional family life was visible everywhere. Lucy's school artwork on the refrigerator, books scattered across the coffee table, the photo of Rose that Lucy had placed beside Tom's picture of Sarah on the mantelpiece. "Lucy," Miss Foster began, "can you tell me how you came to live with Officer Mitchell?" Lucy took a deep breath and began telling their story with remarkable composure. She described her life with Rose, their months in the church basement, her decision to seek Tom's help, and Rose's peaceful death surrounded by people who loved her. "And how do you feel about living here with Officer Mitchell?" Miss Foster asked. "I feel safe," Lucy replied simply. "Tom takes good care of me, and he's teaching me things about having a family that I never knew before." "What kinds of things?" Lucy considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important conversations. "He taught me that families can choose each other, not just be born to each other. And he taught me that taking care of people who are sad or sick or lonely is one of the most important things you can do with your life." Miss Kellum leaned forward with obvious interest. "Can you tell me more about that? About taking care of people?" Lucy's face brightened as she described the connections they'd been facilitating, Mrs. Hartley's friendship with James Chun, the weekly dinners that had evolved into a support network, the practical help they provided for people facing medical crises or social isolation. "Tom says that when people help each other, everybody gets stronger," Lucy explained. "Like when Mrs. Hartley drives James to his treatments, she feels useful and he feels cared for. And when James's daughter Sarah comes here to learn about taking care of sick people, she feels less scared about her dad's illness." Ms. Foster was taking detailed notes, but her expression remained skeptical. "Lucy, do you understand that Officer Mitchell is not your legal guardian? That this living arrangement is temporary until the court makes official decisions about your custody?" Lucy nodded soberly. "I understand about legal things, but I also understand about love things, and those are different. Tom loves me the way a father loves a daughter, and I love him the way a daughter loves a father. The legal parts will catch up when they're ready." Tom felt his heart breaking with pride and fear simultaneously. Lucy's wisdom and emotional intelligence were obvious, but he worried that Miss Foster might interpret her maturity as evidence that she'd been forced to grow up too quickly under his care. "Officer Mitchell," Miss Foster said, turning her attention back to Tom, "while Lucy appears to be thriving in your care, we have serious concerns about the irregular nature of this placement and the additional activities you've been facilitating." She consulted her notes again. "Our investigation indicates that you've been hosting gatherings in your home for individuals with various medical and social challenges, providing transportation and assistance, and essentially operating an informal support network without proper licensing or oversight." Tom realized the bureaucratic trap he'd walked into. By following Sarah's vision and helping isolated people connect with each other, he'd created something that looked suspicious to authorities who were trained to regulate, rather than facilitate organic community building. "Ms. Foster," Tom said carefully, "I understand your concerns about proper procedures and oversight, but I'm not operating a business or a formal program. I'm simply helping people who need support find each other and build relationships." That's exactly the problem, Officer Mitchell. Unlicensed social services can create liability issues for the county, and your dual role as both Lucy's caregiver and the facilitator of these activities raises questions about your judgment and priorities. Tom felt the familiar anger rising not at Miss Foster personally, but at a system that seemed designed to prevent rather than encourage the kind of organic community building that people desperately needed. "What are you recommending?" Tom asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer. Ms. Foster's expression grew more formal. "We're recommending that Lucy be placed in temporary foster care while we conduct a more thorough investigation of the situation. We've identified an excellent family who specializes in providing stable environments for children who've experienced trauma and loss." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. After everything they'd built together, after all the healing and hope and love they'd discovered, the system was going to tear their family apart based on procedural concerns and liability fears. Lucy moved closer to Tom on the couch, her small hand finding his arm with the instinctive comfort she'd always provided during difficult moments. "Ms. Foster," Lucy said quietly, "I appreciate that you want to ensure I'm safe and cared for, but I need you to understand something important." The caseworker looked surprised that a 7-year-old was addressing her directly. "I've lived in foster homes before," Lucy continued with calm certainty. "They were nice families, and they meant well. But they weren't my family. Tom is my family. Not because papers say so, but because we chose each other and we take care of each other, and we're building something together that helps other people too." She paused, looking directly into Miss Foster's eyes with startling intensity. "If you take me away from Tom, you'll be breaking up a family that's working. And you'll also be stopping something that helps lots of other people feel less alone. Is that really what's best for me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the social services system represented. Tom watched Miss Foster's face, trying to read whether Lucy's words had any impact on someone trained to prioritize procedure over personal connection. Ms. Kellum was writing rapidly in her notebook, and Tom caught her glancing at her colleague with an expression that suggested disagreement with the recommended course of action. "Lucy," Miss Foster said finally, "I understand that you feel attached to Officer Mitchell, but my job is to ensure your long-term welfare, which requires following established procedures for child placement and care." Tom realized that this was the moment of truth, not just for his future with Lucy, but for everything Sarah had envisioned about creating families and communities for people who'd lost their traditional support systems. He could accept the system's decision and let Lucy be placed elsewhere, or he could fight for what they built together and risk losing everything. Tom stood up from the couch, feeling the weight of his police badge in his pocket and the even heavier weight of responsibility for Lucy's future. For 30 years, he'd worked within the system, followed procedures, trusted the proper channels would lead to just outcomes. Now he was facing a moment where the system and justice stood in direct opposition to each other. "Ms. Foster," Tom said quietly, "I need to tell you something before you make your final recommendation." He walked to the mantelpiece where Lucy's photo of Rose sat beside his wedding picture of Sarah, picking up both frames and holding them carefully in his hands. 3 months ago, I was a widower counting down to retirement, going through the motions of living without any real purpose or hope for the future. I thought my life was essentially over, not ended, but finished in any meaningful way. Ms. Foster glanced at her watch, but Miss Kellum was listening with obvious interest. Then a 7-year-old girl walked up to my patrol car and asked me to follow her to church. That request changed everything, not just for me, but for dozens of people in this community who were facing their own versions of loss and isolation. Tom set the pictures back on the mantel and turned to face the caseworkers directly. Lucy didn't just find a home with me. She reminded me what home actually means. She taught me that family isn't about meeting bureaucratic requirements. It's about showing up for each other every single day, especially when showing up is difficult. He gestured toward the living room where evidence of their expanded family was visible: cards from Mrs. Hartley, drawings from James Chun's daughter, a schedule of weekly dinners and support group meetings posted on the refrigerator. And she's helped me understand something that my late wife was trying to teach me before she died, that the most important thing any of us can do is create connections between people who need each other but don't know how to find each other. Ms. Foster shifted impatiently. "Officer Mitchell, while your personal growth is admirable, my responsibility is to ensure Lucy's welfare according to established standards and procedures." "What if the established standards are wrong?" Tom asked directly. "What if following procedures in this case would cause more harm than good?" The question clearly made Miss Foster uncomfortable, but before she could respond, Lucy stood up beside Tom with the serious expression she wore when making important announcements. "Ms. Foster," Lucy said politely, "may I show you something?" Without waiting for permission, Lucy walked to the bookshelf where she'd organized a photo album, not the family history that Rose had given her, but a new collection of pictures documenting their expanded community over the past few weeks. "These are the people who come to our house for dinner every week," Lucy explained, opening the album to reveal photos of Mrs. Hartley helping James Chun with his medication schedule, James's daughter Sarah learning to cook with Lucy, several elderly individuals from the hospital support network sharing meals and conversation around Tom's dining room table. "And these are the people who help each other with rides to doctor appointments and grocery shopping and just not being lonely," Lucy continued, turning pages to show pictures of their informal support network in action. Ms. Kellum moved closer to examine the photos, her expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "Lucy, can you tell me more about how this works? How these people found each other?" Lucy launched into a detailed explanation of their network. Mrs. Hartley had been attending chemotherapy sessions alone until she connected with James. How James's teenage children had been struggling to understand their father's illness until they met other families facing similar challenges. How several elderly patients had formed carpools and grocery sharing arrangements that kept them independent longer. "Tom says that Sarah, that's his wife who died, she planned all of this before she got too sick," Lucy explained. "She wrote letters to lots of people who were sad or scared or lonely, and she told them how to find each other so they could help each other feel better." Tom realized that Lucy was unconsciously demonstrating exactly why their unconventional family worked so well. Her natural ability to see connections between people, her instinct for offering comfort and practical help, her wisdom about the difference Between bureaucratic solutions and human solutions, all of it was evidence of the kind of person she was becoming under his care. Ms. Kellum was writing rapidly in her notebook, occasionally glancing at her colleague with expressions that suggested growing disagreement with the recommended course of action. "Miss Foster," Miss Kellum said quietly, "I think we need to consider whether disrupting this placement would actually serve Lucy's best interests." Miss Foster's expression grew stern. "Miss Kellum, our job is to follow established procedures, not to make exceptions based on emotional appeals. Our job is to serve the best interests of children," Miss Kellum replied more firmly. "And I'm seeing clear evidence that Lucy is thriving in this environment in ways that go far beyond basic care and safety." The tension between the two caseworkers was palpable, and Tom realized that Lucy's future might depend on the outcome of their professional disagreement. At that moment, the front door opened and Sheriff Martinez walked in without knocking, a liberty he'd taken since becoming a regular visitor to their extended family dinners. "Sorry I'm late," Martinez said, then stopped short when he saw the official visitors. "I didn't realize you had company." Tom felt both relief and apprehension at his friend's arrival. Martinez's support had been crucial in giving them time to build their relationship, but his presence now might be seen as an attempt to use official influence to circumvent proper procedures. "Sheriff Martinez," Miss Foster said formally, "we're conducting an investigation into Lucy Washington's current placement situation." Martinez looked at Tom, then at Lucy, then back at the caseworkers with the measuring days that had made him an effective law enforcement officer for 25 years. "Ms. Foster, I assume you're evaluating whether Lucy is receiving appropriate care and whether her current placement serves her best interests. That's correct." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "Then, you should probably know that over the past 3 months, I've observed the most remarkable transformation I've seen in my entire career. Not just in Officer Mitchell, who's rediscovered his sense of purpose and calling, but in this entire community." He gestured toward the photo album Lucy was still holding. "These people, Mrs. Hartley, James Chun, the others, they were isolated, struggling, facing serious challenges alone. Now they're part of a support network that's keeping people independent, healthy, and engaged with life in ways that no formal program could match." Ms. Foster looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Sheriff Martinez, while community building is admirable, our concern is proper oversight and accountability for child welfare services." "And my concern," Martinez replied with quiet authority, "is that you're about to destroy something extraordinary based on procedural requirements rather than actual outcomes." He looked directly at Miss Foster with the kind of intense focus that had made him effective in countless difficult situations. "Miss Foster, in your professional opinion, does Lucy appear to be suffering any harm in her current placement? Is she showing signs of neglect, abuse, or inappropriate care?" The question forced Miss Foster to confront the obvious reality. Lucy was clearly thriving physically, emotionally, and socially in Tom's care. "The child appears to be well cared for," Miss Foster admitted reluctantly. "But that doesn't address the procedural irregularities." "The procedural irregularities," Martinez interrupted gently, "exist because Tom Mitchell chose to follow his conscience rather than his training manual. Sometimes that's what real justice requires." Tom watched Lucy during this exchange, amazed by her composure as adults debated her future. She stood quietly beside him, her small hand resting on his arm, radiating the kind of calm confidence that came from absolute certainty about where she belonged. "Miss Foster," Lucy said quietly, drawing everyone's attention, "can I ask you something?" The caseworker nodded. "Do you have children?" Miss Foster looked surprised by the question. "I have a daughter. She's about your age." "And how would you feel if someone told you that they were going to take her away from you because you loved her in the wrong way or because you were helping other families that needed support?" The question hung in the air with devastating simplicity. Lucy had cut through all the bureaucratic complexity to the essential human truth. This was about whether love and commitment mattered more than procedural compliance. Ms. Foster stared at Lucy for a long moment, and Tom could see something shifting in her expression. "That's different," Miss Foster said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "No," Lucy replied with gentle certainty. "It's exactly the same. Tom is my family. I'm his family. We take care of each other, and we help other people find family too. That's what families do." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Miss Kellum's pen moving rapidly across her notebook. Finally, she looked up at her colleague with obvious determination. "Miss Foster, I'm recommending that we approve the continuation of Lucy's current placement pending completion of the formal guardianship process." Miss Foster's expression showed clear frustration with her colleague's position. "Miss Kellum, that's not the recommendation we discussed." "No," Miss Kellum replied firmly. "It's the recommendation that serves Lucy's best interests, which is supposed to be our primary consideration." Tom felt hope stirring in his chest, but he also understood that this disagreement between caseworkers might simply delay rather than resolve their situation. Lucy seemed to sense the continued uncertainty. She walked over to Miss Foster and looked up at her with the serious expression that preceded her most important statements. "Miss Foster," Lucy said quietly, "I know you're trying to do what's right for me, but what's right for me is staying with Tom and continuing to help other people find families like we found each other. Will you please trust me to know what's best for my own heart?" The question was spoken with such dignity and certainty that even Miss Foster seemed affected by its impact. She looked at Lucy for a long moment, then at Tom, then at the photo album, documenting their extended community. Finally, Miss Foster closed her briefcase with an expression of reluctant acceptance. "We'll be recommending expedited processing of your guardianship application," she said to Tom. "But I want monthly progress reports and full compliance with all legal requirements." Tom felt relief flooding through him, but he also understood that this was just the beginning of their official journey toward becoming a legally recognized family. "Thank you," he said simply. As the caseworkers prepared to leave, Lucy approached Miss Foster one final time. "Miss Foster, if you ever want to bring your daughter to one of our dinners, she'd be welcome. Sometimes kids need to see that families can be bigger than just the people who live in the same house." Miss Foster looked down at this remarkable child, who had just extended an invitation to expand their community even further, and for the first time since arriving, she smiled. "I'll think about that, Lucy. I'll definitely think about that." 6 months later, on a warm May evening that reminded Tom of the spring Sarah had loved so much, he stood in the backyard of their home watching Lucy teach Mrs. Hartley's granddaughter how to plant tomatoes in the garden. They'd expanded to feed their growing community family. The legal guardianship had been finalized in February, with Judge Catherine Walsh commenting that she'd rarely seen such overwhelming community support for a custody petition. Ellen Martinez had helped them navigate every requirement, and even Ms. Foster had submitted a positive evaluation after observing their household dynamics during several unannounced visits. But the real transformation went far beyond legal documents. Their dining room table, which had once sat empty every evening, now accommodated 12 people for weekly family dinners. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley had become Lucy's honorary grandmother, teaching her cooking skills and receiving the kind of devoted attention that made her eyes sparkle with renewed purpose. James Chun and his children had become regular fixtures, with teenage Sarah serving as Lucy's big sister and mentor. The network had grown organically, just as Sarah had envisioned. Dr. Patricia Wells now referred isolated patients to their informal support system. Pastor Williams from First Baptist Church had begun coordinating with them to identify elderly parishioners who needed practical assistance. Even the county social services office had started recognizing their community as a resource for adults and children who needed unconventional family structures. Tom had taken early retirement from the police force in March, using his pension and Sarah's life insurance to fund what had become known as the Sarah Mitchell Family Connection Center, a cash nonprofit organization that facilitated chosen families for people who had lost their traditional support systems. "Tom," Lucy called from the garden, "Mrs. Hartley says the tomatoes need deeper holes. Can you show us how Sarah used to plant them?" Tom walked over to join the 3 generations working in the dirt, feeling the familiar warmth that came from watching Lucy naturally bridge connections between people of different ages and backgrounds. At 8 years old, she had developed an intuitive understanding of what people needed to feel valued and included. "Sarah always said tomatoes grow best when they have plenty of room for their roots," Tom explained, kneeling beside them in the garden. Just like families. Mrs. Hartley's granddaughter, 10-year-old Emma, whose parents had been killed in a car accident the previous winter, looked up at Tom with the serious expression that reminded him powerfully of Lucy during their early days together. "Tom," Emma said quietly, "do you think my parents would be proud of how our new family is helping me feel better?" The question struck Tom with its directness and its echo of his own journey from grief to purpose. Emma had been placed with Mrs. Hartley through their network after aging out of a foster system that couldn't find appropriate long-term placement for her. Grandmother's care. "Emma, I think your parents are probably amazed by how much love you've brought into Mrs. Hartley's life and how much love she's given back to you," Tom replied. "And I think they'd be proud of how you're learning to help other people who are sad or scared." Emma nodded with satisfaction and returned to her planting, but Tom caught Mrs. Hartley wiping tears from her eyes. Their relationship had saved them, both Emma from institutional care, Mrs. Hartley from the loneliness that had been slowly killing her spirit as the evening progressed. Other members of their extended family began arriving for their weekly gathering. James Chun brought homemade spring rolls and news that his latest medical tests showed continued improvement. His daughter Sarah, now 16, had become Lucy's devoted mentor and was planning to study social work in college, inspired by what she'd witnessed in their community. Dr. Wells arrived with a new family, a Conley, recently divorced father, and his 12-year-old son, who was struggling with isolation and depression. Tom watched Lucy immediately approach the boy with the kind of gentle attention that made strangers feel welcome and valued. "This is Marcus," Lucy said, leading the shy boy toward the garden where the other children were working. "His dad is a teacher, and he likes to read the same kinds of books I do. Marcus, this is Emma and Sarah. They're going to help you plant vegetables for our summer dinners." Tom marveled at Lucy's instinctive ability to identify what people needed and provide it without fanfare or self-consciousness. She had inherited Sarah's gift for seeing potential connections and creating spaces where healing could happen naturally. Sheriff Martinez arrived with his wife Carmen, who had become the unofficial coordinator of their meal planning and household logistics. Their own children, now in college, regularly returned home to join the dinners and help with various projects that had grown out of their community connections. "Tom," Martinez said, settling into a lawn chair with obvious contentment, "have I mentioned lately that Sarah would be incredibly proud of what you two have built here?" Tom looked around his backyard, where 3 generations of chosen family were sharing food, stories, and the kind of easy affection that came from people who had learned to show up for each other consistently over time. "I think about that every day," Tom replied. Not just about whether she'd be proud, but about how she somehow knew this was exactly what I needed to become who I was supposed to be. Lucy appeared at his side, settling into the lawn chair beside him with the comfortable intimacy that had developed between them over months of shared challenges and discoveries. "Tom," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that, sweetheart?" "Do you think there are other police officers out there who are sad like you were?" who maybe need to find kids like me who need families. Tom felt his heart expand with recognition of Lucy's perpetual concern for others, who might be struggling with problems they'd learned to solve together. "I think there probably are," Tom said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because Mrs. Kellum called today while you were at the grocery store. She said there's a police officer in the next county whose wife died last year, and there's a little boy whose grandpa just died who was taking care of him. She thought maybe we could help them find each other the way Grandma Rose helped us find each other." Tom looked at this remarkable child, who continued to amaze him with her capacity for seeing solutions where others saw only problems. Lucy had transformed from someone who needed rescue to someone who actively facilitated rescue for others. "What do you think we should do?" Tom asked. Lucy considered the question with the thoughtfulness she brought to all important decisions. "I think we should invite them for dinner next week, and maybe show them the photo albums so they can see how families like ours work. And if they want to try being a family together, we can help them figure out how to make it happen." Tom felt the familiar sensation of his world expanding to accommodate new possibilities for love and connection. Sarah's vision had never been limited to creating one unusual family. She had imagined a network of people who would help others create their own versions of chosen family and community support. "I think that's exactly what we should do," Tom said, and meant every word. As twilight settled over their backyard gathering, Tom found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than a year ago, he had been a man merely surviving his grief, counting down to a retirement that held no real promise of purpose or joy. Now he was surrounded by people who had become family through choice rather than blood, committed to work that felt like the most important thing he'd ever done. Lucy leaned against his arm with the trust that had defined their relationship from that first evening in the church basement. "Tom, do you ever miss the way your life used to be before everything changed?" Tom looked at the faces around him. Mrs. Hartley teaching Emma how to identify different types of flowers. James and his children laughing at something Carmen had said. Dr. Wells deep in conversation with the new father about resources for single parents. Sheriff Martinez helping Marcus overcome his shyness about joining group activities. "Lucy," Tom said with absolute certainty, "I can barely remember who I was before you walked up to my patrol car and asked me to follow you to church. And I can't imagine wanting to be anyone else." Lucy smiled with the radiant satisfaction of someone who had found exactly where she belonged and had helped others do the same. "Good," she said simply, "because tomorrow Mrs. Kellum is bringing 3 more people who need to find families, and we're going to help them figure out how love works." Tom laughed with the joy that had become his constant companion since learning to see strangers as potential family members and problems as opportunities for connection. "Then I guess we better make sure we have enough chairs around the table," he said. "Don't worry," Lucy replied with the confidence of someone who had never met a challenge she couldn't solve through compassion and practical action. Love always finds a way to make room for everyone who needs it. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above their chosen family, Tom understood that Sarah's final gift hadn't been just Lucy, or even the network of connections they built together. Her greatest gift had been the reminder that love multiplies rather than divides, that families grow stronger when they open their hearts to others who need belonging, and that the most important legacy anyone can leave is a community of people committed to showing up for each other. The photo on his mantle now showed Lucy surrounded by their extended family at Christmas, her smile bright with the joy of someone who had found not just a home, but a calling. Beside it, Sarah's picture seemed to reflect approval and peace, as if she were watching their expanding circle of love with the satisfaction of someone who had planted seeds that continued to bloom long after the gardener was gone. Tom took Lucy's hand as they walked toward the house, where their family was gathering around the dinner table for another evening of shared stories, practical planning, and the kind of unconditional acceptance that transforms strangers into relatives. "Ready for tomorrow?" Tom asked. "Always," Lucy replied, and Tom knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not just as father and daughter, but as partners in the ongoing work of creating families for people who had forgotten they deserved to be loved.